So forgiveness is to be granted whenever requested without limitation, no conditions. That's all-inclusive. And then if you look down on page 5 towards the bottom there, Roman numeral number 4, there are consequences of refusing to forgive. In A, he says, because you are commanded to forgive others, you sin when you refuse to forgive. And in B, you show your base ingratitude for God's merciful forgiveness toward you when you do not forgive others. It isn't just between you and that other person. It's between you and the Lord. Let's look at that passage there, Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35. This is another passage on the subject of forgiveness. And this is the passage where Jesus says to forgive 7 times 70, there in verse 22. And then he tells another story to the disciples. They're having a bit of difficulty with this particular lesson, aren't they? He says in verse 23, for this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a certain king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he had begun to settle them, there was brought to him one who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, 10,000 talents is probably at least $100 million today, at least. It's a lot of money. And the master, in his generosity, forgives the slave because the slave says, I can't repay it. I just can't. And the master says, you are forgiven. The debt is over. You don't owe me a thing. Now that slave, if you see there in verse 28, that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. Remember, a denarius was the 1 day's wage. So 100 days' wage, that's a whole lot less than $100 million, isn't it? This is a fellow slave. You know, maybe it's 100,000, at most $100, at most $1,000, in comparison to $100 million. This guy has just been forgiven of all that money, and he won't forgive this slave. As a matter of fact, he has his fellow slave thrown in prison because of that. Well, the master found out about that. And so in verse 32, the master summoning him, his Lord said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that $100 million because you entreated me. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave, even as I had mercy on you? And notice in the 34th verse it says, and his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed him. And then notice 35. So shall my heavenly Father also do to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. That's heavy. I don't know how that translates. I mean, that's serious. That's very serious. God is saying, don't you realize how much I've forgiven you just when you were born again? How many sins I've forgiven you of all that tremendous amount? And you're not even willing to forgive your brother of one sin? He says, where's your heart? So he says, we are to forgive.